and welcome to the 10th anniversary of our wonderful festival. You know, before we start, I just want to give a shout out to the incredible crew who's put this together. You know, it's like like NASA has got nothing on them. You know, Jamie's got the creativity, he thought of this moon landing and he raised the funds, and Debbie Miller is one who can engineer it, bring it all together. Deborah Deja makes sure she gets people with the right stuff to come and talk about their books. And then Aaron Espinoza provides the leadership to make it all happen. So it's really wonderful to welcome all you back here again. Richard Reeves really doesn't need introduction because you're here, so you know who he is. And he published this book 2 years ago, and since then it's kind of create this firestorm of discussion, and it's been feted and lauded by New York Times, The Economist, New Yorker as being one of the most important books. But interestingly, Richard, you had a lot of trepidation about writing this book.
Yeah, I did. Well, first of all, thank you for that introduction and for having me here. A couple of things to get out of the way. First of all, sometimes people come thinking that they're going to hear from Richard Reeves, the esteemed biographer and historian. That has happened. So if anybody's in the audience expecting him, he's sadly lost to us, of course, quite recently. And he and I were occasionally confused for each other. He was a lovely man. So if that's who you're expecting instead of me, I apologize. Second thing is, let's get it out of the way. I know I sound funny. I'm from East Tennessee. I am. I live in Butler, Tennessee. But I'm obviously from the UK. Yeah, I had a lot. So I was at the Brookings Institution for 10 years. I'm still affiliated there. I've done a lot of work on inequality and race and education. And then I just kept hitting these data points, which we might get into, which is like, there's a lot of men and boys that are really struggling on a lot of fronts. And either we're not talking about that, or we're not talking about it in the right way. Policymakers, think tankers, scholars, writers are like, you don't want to touch that. People will think you're one of them, right? And you just can't avoid it. In the current polarized political climate, and there's discussion here about polarization, of course, you just can't win. You can't talk about the problems of boys and men without being cast out into the wilderness. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, in that case, I really do need to do it because I'm a scholar, I have charts, I'm quite dull, as you'll discover in the next 45 minutes. And if you can't talk about this straightforwardly without being accused of becoming some alt-right monster, then the only people who are allowed to talk about this are alt-right monsters. And so then you wonder, why are so many of our young men listening to all these alt-right monsters? And I'm like, well, because we're not talking about it. And so we're leaving the playing field empty. And that is irresponsible.
So you're identifying multiple areas where boys and men are either struggling or being left behind. Right. Education, workplace, family life, and even mental health.
Yeah, so in education, there's just a huge gender gap. And you have daughters, I have sons, and so we have different experiences. But just if you look at the gender gaps in education now, they're very big. So on college campuses, for example, there's a bigger gender gap on college campuses today than there was in 1972 when we passed Title IX. It's just the other way around. So there's about a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women, which was compared to 13 in 79. So we have slightly bigger than Title IX level gender inequality on college campuses, but it's the other way around. In high schools, 2/3 of the top high school students measured by GPA are girls. 2/3 of the bottom are boys. In the labor market, we see working class men especially, and black men, really their wages just not growing at all. So in 2019, the median American man was earning a little bit less than the median American man in 1979. Less, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And you don't see it at the top. In mental health, which is, perhaps I'll just say one more thing on that, which is we just saw the life expectancy gap between men and women grow in the US. It's gone from 5 to 6 years, and that's for all kinds of reasons, COVID among them. But one of them is rising deaths of despair among men from opioid overdoses, which was skewing male, and suicide. And one of the things I'm very troubled by is the very significant rise in suicide rates among young men. Suicide rates are 4 times higher among men than women, and all of the growth since 2010 has been among young men, which has gone up by about 1/3. So we lost about the same number of lives to suicide among men last year as we did the lives of women to breast cancer. And so these are tragic numbers on both sides of that, of course, but I'm going to respectfully suggest that we're still not having a good enough conversation about that crisis.
The biggest suicide rate in men is in the, I thought, up to the 64 age group. Isn't it in the middle age?
Yes, so...
And I think people will be happy to know that you consider that to be young men.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you, but I keep redefining my definition of young. And in fact, I've mostly worked in economics, and there's a term in economics that some of you will know, which is prime age workers. And prime age workers are defined as 25 to 54. Well, I'm 54, and screw you. Economist, so yeah, young. But you're right. So there's a difference here between level and change. And so it is still the case that it is among older men where you see these higher rates, especially among divorced men, actually, very high rates. But all of the rise since 2010 has been among younger men, and actually the lines are converging such that actually there's less of an age gradient than there was. And as I said, that's something I just don't think is getting enough attention.
Let's go back to the education, and that you highlighted these gaps that occur. High school students, top thirds, 2/3 are girls, bottom 2/3 are boys. Do they enter school behind and it gets worse, or do they enter school about the same and then it diverges in high school? Where does that
So
occur?
the first thing to say is that the really big gaps are on the literacy side, so in English and literacy, where in the median school district in the US now, the boys are a grade level behind girls in English. They're a bit behind in math, but in math, the gap is very narrow and closes by 12th grade. But the short answer is...
The boys are behind in math.
The boys slightly behind in math, yeah. And in poor school districts, they're a long way behind in math as well. In fact, in most states now, girls have overtaken in math at the average.
I thought in 4th grade, though, the boys were a little bit better than girls.
So again, the danger of getting to the weeds here is a lot of this depends on how we're measuring it. Whether it's through standardized tests or GPA, et cetera.
Okay.
But to all intents and purposes, there really isn't a gap in math anymore. And that's true internationally, by the way. If you look at the internationals, there's just, or if there is, it's like the math gap in favor of boys is like 5 points, whereas the English gap in favor of girls is like 30 points, right, depending on measure. And so the boys start behind. The gap widens in middle school. By 8th or 9th grade, you're really seeing these gaps open up. And then on some measures, they narrow a little bit again by 12th grade, but on a lot of the others, they don't. And it seems like the die is kind of not cast, but it's that 8th, 9th grade transition into high school. And we might get into this, but one of my observations is that our education system doesn't take account of the fact that boys mature a bit later than girls, right? And I'm not using mature in a judgmental way, just neurologically. The typical 14-year-old girl is more advanced particularly in her social and study skills than the typical 14-year-old boy, which when I say that, everyone's like, well, duh, you had to spend 10 years at Brookings to find that out. But we don't in any way account for that difference in our education policy. And so actually I think what's happened is that girls were always at a neurological advantage, but that was disguised by sexism because we weren't encouraging girls to go on to college and do well. Once we took the brakes off, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, there isn't more work to do on behalf of women and girls, but once we largely took the brakes off education, the girls just blew past the boys because they're actually at a neurological advantage, especially in those middle and high school years.
So let me think about this. Do girls develop on a certain path and boys are on the same path but just delayed, or actually 2 different paths of development?
In terms of the skills we care about for education, so we've mentioned GPA, right? So the girls are way ahead of boys on GPA in high school. So as I've said, 2/3 of the top 10% are girls. But on standardized tests, SAT and ACT, there really isn't much of a gender gap. And so what that tells us, I think, is that it's not that girls are smarter than boys, or vice versa, right? Important to know. but they have got their act together earlier than boys. GPA, and I have 3 boys, so I speak from experience here, GPA rewards turning in your homework. Now, that is a virtually magical achievement for a 15-year-old boy, it turns out, right? And so what GPA is really capturing is what these social scientists call non-cognitive skills, turning your homework in skills, right? Turning in your homework requires you, like, to turn in your chemistry homework, say, you have to be in chemistry class when it's assigned, be paying attention, make a note somehow that it was made, remember later that you're supposed to do it, decide to do it rather than play Call of Duty, which, let's be honest, it's chemistry homework, and then, and here's the one that really kills me, point number 6, turn it in.
Dude, maybe boys have more dogs that eat the homework.
A lot more. It seems like there's a huge asymmetry in dog ownership among adolescents.
And, and I think our audience is sophisticated enough to realize that you're talking about an average here, that there's tremendous intergroup variation, right? I mean, at the top two-thirds, it's 1/3 boys. So there still are boys who are successful, and there's still girls who are struggling.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. These are at the average. But then, so the interesting, this applies to so many things we could talk about, but also so many things that could even be discussed here more generally. Somebody once said, our main intellectual problem is the inability to consider overlapping distributions, right? Like, think about height, right? Yeah. We know what it means to say that men are taller than women.
Right.
Right? We know that, like we did it here, right? It doesn't mean every woman's taller than every man, right? It means that 95% of the people over 6 foot are male and whatever, right? So the most interesting question is always just like, does the distribution overlap, but how much does it overlap? What are the differences? And crucially, do they matter? So you take something like SAT and ACT scores, those distributions now are almost identical, even if there's a slight average one way or the other. But GPA, that's not true. As I said, like when you've got the top 10%, 2/3 girls, bottom 10%, 2/3 boys, those distributions are quite different now. And then the question is, does it matter? Well, does high school GPA matter? Well, I tell you what, it does. And increasingly, it matters for college admissions. So I'll make a really nerdy point, but I think it helps to illustrate this discussion. When colleges go test optional in their admissions policies, what do you think the biggest effect is? More girls. 4 percentage point increase in girls. Doesn't really affect ethnic minorities, doesn't really affect race. 4 percentage point increase in the female share. Why? Because standardized tests are the only high school measure where boys are holding their own. On every other measure, they're being smoked by the girls. So if you go test optional, you skew even more female than you already do. And we're already 60-40 female in higher education, which is great, except it's not great.
It's really, your book came out in 22, and 22 was the year of the U.S. Census Bureau. I think you didn't have access to these stats, but the Pew Research came out that compared to 2011, now we look at 2022, there are 1.2 million fewer young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 enrolled in college. That's right. Despite the fact that there were actually more high school graduates. Okay, so it's not a smaller number of high school graduates. And of this 1.2 million decrease, it's 1 million boys or males, and only 200,000 girls. What do you think is the reason? I mean, I understand 2022 is the COVID, right? It's pandemic, but why would it affect males so much more than females?
Well, I mean, male college enrollment cratered when COVID hit, much more than female did. So there's a sort of bigger question, which is what's happening around higher education and boys and men generally. Yeah. And number one, they're just not as prepared for college. So, like, unless you discriminate in favor of men in your admissions, which is what the Ivy Leagues are doing now. Yeah. I mean, they have been doing quietly for a while now. If you're actually being, if you're not discriminating, then you're going to skew strongly female, because the girls are doing much better in high school. So, but the other interesting thing is that the men are much less likely to complete college, and so the risk of going to college and then not completing is much higher for men than for women. And that's making men a bit risk averse around taking on debt. And this sense of like, is college worth it debate, which is a real debate, it's an important one, seemed to be really taking hold among men in particular. And the last thing I'll say, it comes back to your point about non-cognitive skills and future orientation. One of the things that happens when your frontal cortex develops, which happens after puberty, which happens earlier in girls and young women than men, is the ability to, we talked a bit about Angela Duckworth and grit before, right? Yeah. The ability to do something now that sucks and it's horrible because my future self is going to thank me for it, right? That is a difficult thing for all of us to do every day, right?
So men really like marshmallows, is what you're saying.
Men are not so good on the marshmallow test. But if you say to the kind of typical 17 or 18-year-old boy now, hey, how do you fancy spending 4 to 6 years in an expensive education system for uncertain rewards, doing really boring stuff that you've hated for the last 4 years in high school, they're just less likely to say yay. Whereas more, I think, the young women and girls, they've got a message which is empowerment and independence and get a good education, and they're just a bit more able to stick with it. So the biggest, once you control for all the other educational factors, the biggest risk factor for not completing college is being male. And so the number of colleges and institutions,
the dropouts
much higher among men, much higher. And so these colleges now, they're really struggling not only to attract the men, but to retain them. And so it's once they're on campuses, they're really struggling. And this is, of course, against the whole background of whole debate about higher education and the role of education.
I think universities have done these surveys on it, but they have a sense that once their population gender skews 70-30, that they are viewed as much less attractive universities. So they try to keep it 60-40, and so the untold story is that a lot of schools now are making it a little easier for men to get in.
The selective privates are doing that. The publics generally aren't.
It seems like Title IX would make that illegal, right? Because Title IX doesn't say, it just says you can't discriminate based on
Title IX says you can't discriminate based on sex, with one exception. If you're a private institution, you are allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex in your undergraduate admissions policy. There's a carve-out in Title IX
I thought if you got federal funding, you were just,
no. There's a carve-out in Title IX allowing you to discriminate. Why? To protect the single-sex colleges.
But there's something...
it now has this weird, like, you can't be Wellesley unless you're allowed to discriminate in favor of women in your admissions, right? And so there's this carve-out in Title IX, but now it's giving them a little bit of wiggle room to keep this. Honestly, post-affirmative action, the spotlight now on higher education admissions, this thumb on the scale in favor of men in selectives, I don't think it's going to last. I think that people are going to start saying, hang on, why is a better qualified woman not getting into Vanderbilt compared to a man? And the parents and the women themselves are going to start saying, that's not fair. And they're right. And that's going to open up this debate.
Richard, you know, if they're still doing worse at college age, that implies almost that there's not like really a catch-up.
No, there isn't a catch-up right now. And so I think that's why we should consider things like starting boys in school a year later. Right? That's one of my proposals.
But if there's not a catch-up, does that year really help?
Well, so we should be, So
we're going to do this thing, okay? So I got 3 daughters.
Yeah.
So what do I know? So I reach out to a friend of mine who's got 3 sons, a great dad, and I reach out to him in March and say, please read this book, and we're going to get together in June, and you can tell me about it. Get together in June. He says, Khoi, I didn't get to read the book. And then his wife says, I read the book. And I was like, that's what it's about. That's what it's about, you know? Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
There's no catch-up.
No, there isn't. Well, the bad news is the gap narrows, but it never completely closes. It narrows. So the average, by 25, you know, the frontal cortex of the male has developed, but there's on some of these scores around conscientious, just as a personality thing, like at the average, women are more conscientious than men. I mean, that's.
We talked about you mentioned that, you know, we talked about Angela Duckworth just now, and Angela Duckworth is the one who came up with the grit scale, and it's like, do you finish what you start? Do you show gratitude? Are you curious? Do you have, you know, and she did all this work with Martin Selig, and she was TED Talk and MacArthur Prize, but there's a lot about grit, and when you apply her scale to gender, it turns out women are more gritty than men. So it kind of flies in this cultural thing we have, men being resilient, gritty, hunter, you know. Yeah, but it's actually women are grittier.
It's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? But
you've got a number of these counterintuitive things in your book that come
up. Well, actually, the other thing is that if we're defining grit as this conscientiousness and this future orientation and so on, then yeah, women are significantly, and girls especially, are significantly ahead on that, which is why we should take that into account. The really difficult thing about this is how to talk about this in a way that doesn't even implicitly appear to be blaming the boys or the men themselves, right? There's a little bit of an eye-rolling feel to some of this debate, really, and almost a sense of, why can't you be more like your sister? Now, you have only girls, I have only boys, so we haven't had this.
So my wife says, why can't you be more like your daughters?
Why can't you be more like, yeah, exactly. Why can't, or what she's really saying is, why can't you be more like me?
Or make your bed.
Yeah, right. What's wrong? Like, it's sort of what's wrong with you kind of thing. And I get that, but so I just think there's a potentially deep problem here, which is that in the education system in particular, and maybe even some of our families, there's a tendency to treat boys like malfunctioning girls, right? The default, like, this is what you're supposed to be like, and we're in danger of doing a little bit of that now, right, with the grit thing. Like, this is what you're supposed to be like. Why aren't you like that? Rather than saying, hold on, we're all a bit different, and maybe the education system should allow for those differences, rather than saying. Because otherwise the danger is, this is what it's like to be a boy, that doesn't conform to this standard, that's probably something like ADHD. And so I was shocked to discover that among K-12 boys in the US now, 23% have been diagnosed with a developmental disability. Now, I'm sorry, but that can't be right. That has to be the system that's labeling something as a disability. And so let's label it, let's medicate it, let's figure out a way to basically, if we can't change your brain to be more like a female brain, let's medicate it, right? To try and make it something more of a proxy to a parent. And then we wonder why so many of our boys are in so much trouble in terms of their mental health.
Richard's not like a voice crowding in the wilderness here. You know, on this very stage, 6 years ago, this very stage here at the conference, Hannah Rosen spoke about the end of men.
Interesting.
Her book came out 10 years. And I went back even further, about almost 20 years ago, there was this physician named Leonard Sachs, wrote Boys Adrift, and he brought up a lot of these issues.
He did.
And he talked about so-called like the feminization of education, and he identified being diagnosed with ADHD and the implication of being medicated for this. So you know, you can't sit still, there must be something wrong, let's medicate you, and what the potential downsides of that are.
But it's interesting, I mean, I know Hannah Rosen quite well. I didn't know she'd spoken here. But it's a good example of how difficult this debate has become, because Hannah has now done a mea culpa. She's actually apologized for her previous position.
During the COVID.
Yes. She wrote a piece saying, I'm going to go back on some of that end of men stuff. And actually, women, actually what she said was, now that I've seen the kind of depths of the problems faced by women, I was wrong to kind of focus on men. And there's an interesting thing. So the IQ squared, they're called something else now, debate. They'll be angrily forgetting, but there's a debate. So, and when Hannah's book came out, she debated the proposition, men are struggling in society now, or something like that. Men are, we should pay more attention to men. I just debated her, the same subject. She took the other side. And the reason for that is because she's come to believe this is a bit more zero-sum, and that if you want to be on the side of women at this particular political moment and this particular cultural moment, you cannot afford to be being seen as on the side of men.
I think the gains of women are so fragile.
So fragile, look at what's happening with it. And that actually it's self-indulgent and potentially damaging to even have this conversation when there are so many deep issues being faced by women. I understand that, but I think it's profoundly wrong. And if you frame it in that zero-sum way, you create some of the very thing you're so concerned about, which is that so many of our young men feel they're not heard, they're not seen, that if they are, it's only as a problem to be dealt with rather than as someone who deserves empathy. And so it drives, I think it drives more of a political divide between men and women by not saying, you know what, we can think two thoughts at once. We can say there's a bunch of things that still need to be done for women and girls.
Women can.
Right?
Women can.
Women can, Well, that's right. We can think one thing and then 5 minutes later. No, actually, I think that's a cognitive skill, so I think we're okay on that one. I think we're okay on that one.
No,
right.
So you know,
can you drive and have a conversation at the same time? Yeah, we can do that, right?
Now, you've highlighted these differences biologically, why boys may not find the same joy in educational system as girls. Are there things about the educational system also that favor girls over boys?
Yeah, and again, it's important to say none of this is intentional.
No.
Right? There isn't some deep feminist plot.
Cabal.
Right, secretly saying. So, like, for example, if you think the education system, just in terms of the way its age structure works and how important high school is, right, that's 100 years old and it was designed by men. It wasn't like 100 years ago, a bunch of feminists sat around and said, okay, it might take a century, but eventually, right, it's an inadvertent consequence. Two other things that I think inadvertently making the education system less male-friendly than female-friendly are the cratering share of male teachers, right? The share of male teachers when Ronald Reagan came to power in 1980 was 33%. It's now 23% and falling. And back to your point about a tipping point, the difference between 33% and 23% in a profession is not just 10 percentage points. It's the difference between that profession being seen as a female profession as opposed to...
So it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah, then you're hitting a tipping point, and my middle son's becoming a teacher, and there's issues around, it's harder, right? In the same way it's harder to be a female engineer if you're...
And it's worse at the younger ages.
Yeah, I mean, there are basically no men teaching at certainly kindergarten. So one of the stats is that as a share of the occupation, there are at least twice as many women flying US fighter planes as men teaching kindergarten.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I'm all about women flying fighter planes, and they're redesigning the planes so that they fit women, right? Because it turns out that the ejector seats were designed for men, right? So they're redesigning them, which is great. In the end, honestly, I just want the fighter pilots to be able to shoot down the bad people's planes, but fine. And some of them are going to be women. But where is the equivalent efforts to encourage men into education? And you hit 23%, and every year the numbers come out, it just drops and drops and drops. And if we want to send a message to boys that education is something that boys and men do and that they excel at. My own English teacher, Mr. Wyatt, I was in remedial English for quite a while. And if that's not obvious, and you haven't read my book yet, so tell me what you think. And then Mr. Wyatt comes along, who is a Korean War veteran, a part-time bus driver, and an absolute curmudgeon, and he gets a bunch of 15-year-old, mostly working-class boys in tears reading Andrew Marvell's love poetry. Okay. Now, it did matter that it was Mr. Wyatt, because what he told me was, oh, okay, you can be a guy, you can be into words, you can be into poetry, you can be into this. Okay, because up until that point, all of my English teachers have been women, all the girls are doing much better, and I just thought it was a girly thing.
And we accept that it's important to have women teaching STEM classes.
We absolutely, and not only that, but we go out of our way to recruit women to do STEM, and it works, and that's great.
Same reason.
Like, there are so many scholarships to get women into STEM in college, and some people on the more conservative side of this debate say, why are we doing that when now like half the scientists are women, etc.? Why are we still doing that? And I said, because there's still a lot more to go. But there are no scholarships encouraging men into education or psychology or social work. And my new institute, the American Institute for Boys and Men, who knew that I was going to be able to create a whole think tank on this, has just published something showing that in mental health professions, the share of men has fallen even faster. So in psychology and social, on current trends, there'll be no men in psychology by 2046. It's dropped from 60% to 20% male share. And so, where are the efforts to try and get more men into those?
And that's, you think about the implications of that. These things are all interconnected. You talk about the epidemic of deaths of despair among men, and then you're also talking about there are fewer therapists and psychologists who are male. Yeah. So a boy that's depressed or anxious is more likely is having a harder time finding a male therapist to talk to.
That's right. When I've been reaching out for a therapist, I have sometimes found it quite helpful to be able to work with a man. When one of my sons really was struggling, it definitely helped the stuff he was struggling with to have a man. Now, that's not true for everybody, and it's actually hard to find really good research showing that getting a gender match in your therapist has good outcomes because no one's done the research on this. But I do think anecdotally, the evidence from a lot of male psychologists is that they are seeing very high levels of demand, particularly from parents saying, look, I want my boy to get some help, and I think it will help if it's a guy. At the very least, it should be an option. But right now, it's not an option. And if you look at the pipeline, we are turning psychology into an almost entirely female profession. And school counselors, mostly female. And I'll say one more thing on this. I really worry about, so I've talked about the way in which educational success might start to get coded as female. right? So it's actually just seen as a female thing, female teachers, girls doing better, higher education. And so like you want to avoid any sense of these things being coded as somehow female. And I think that mental health care is starting to get coded as female too. And there's a few examples of that. One, the mental health professions, some of the screening mechanisms. But it's not for nothing that we've seen this rise in reported anxiety among adolescent girls and young women. I'm really worried about that. I'm also very interested to note that the Affordable Care Act covers screening for adolescent girls and young women and doesn't cover it for boys and men. Yeah. And there is some evidence that that change in policy in 2012 has helped us pick up more of the anxiety among kind of girls, which is great. But you just kind of think, on what planet do we think it's okay not to screen one gender for anxiety or not for that to be covered by our public health system? And again, no one's fault. Not a cabal of feminists in the Obama White House who hate boys. It's an accident of public policy. But we've got to start taking this stuff more seriously.
If we move on from education now, what are the implications for a less educated male population for the workforce? What's going on there?
Right, so I sort of mentioned that in the middle of the distribution, most men are earning a little bit less than most men did before. And the intersection here with class and race is very important. And if you think about class in particular, we've seen a narrowing of the gender pay gap, not the disappearance, still much more to do, and a widening of the class pay gap. And so upper middle class men at the top, this is almost my previous book, Dream Hoarders, like at the 80th percentile on the top, the men are doing better than
Dream Hoarders, you pass the blame out. It's not just the 1%, though. It's
20%.
It's the 20%.
It's us. I mean, like, I don't know everyone's income in this room, so I shouldn't say that. But if you've got a 4-year college degree and you anything like a 6-figure income, then there's a class divide here.
This is why we put the talk here and not in the London room, because
is that where the top 1%? That's the top
1%. This is the 20%.
It's good to know. It's good to know that. Good to know that. Just to benchmark everybody on the distribution. And actually,
you might change your talk because you're in the London room at the
I
end.
will. I'll change it. It's a completely different set of issues for them. So the class thing's really important. So working class men earning less. There's been a big decline in the labor force participation of prime age men. I'm going to use that term again. But most of it's been among less educated men. That's also where the deaths of despair have been higher. It's where the suicide rates have been higher. It's working class men in particular.
And if you understand, like, if you don't have anything more than a high school education, the chances that you're not going to be in the labor force for men is huge.
It's about a third of the men.
A third. It's a huge thing.
So there's this massive reserve army. I think it's about 9 million or something.
But it's important to understand that that's not because the women have taken the jobs, right? It's not, but that it's so easy for some people to slip into that mindset.
That's right, and it's a good talking point, I would say, among some online manosphere types, which is, well, of course, men aren't working. The women have, quotes, taken the jobs. It's the equivalent of immigrants have taken the jobs, right? It's an old lump of labor fallacy, which is there's only so many jobs to go around, so if those people have got them, then those people won't. It's absolute economic nonsense. Like, we create more jobs, and there's no evidence that women have, quotes, displaced men from the jobs. What's actually happened is that a lot of the jobs that men were traditionally in, manufacturing, construction is actually coming up again now, but those mining, those heavy industry jobs, they have declined disproportionately, and many of the jobs that women are overrepresented in have risen. And so the labor market shifted in a way that's actually been particularly damaging to working class men. Not upper middle class men, but working class men. And that's where you see these deaths of despair, that's where you see these communities really struggling. It's also where the marriage rate has plummeted. Marriage is pretty strong among the upper middle class.
And it seems like women, when they go join the workforce, they create a trickle-down of jobs because they go out and then you got to hire a woman to do what the wife and mother used to do. But men don't move into those jobs. More women move into those.
Well, you just create more economic activity generally. That's right. And now I will say that I think one of the reasons I'm worried about things like education and health is also because there are more jobs required there. So there's actually some looming shortages in a few of these professions, especially in teaching, and struggling to kind of attract particularly good folks into teaching. So you don't want to do that with only half the labor force. And also there are jobs there for the men. But it looks like men are finding it more difficult to transition into the growth parts of the economy, away from the declining bits of the economy. They get a bit stuck. And very interestingly, the geographical mobility of women is now quite a bit higher than men. So women are more likely to move, right? Men are more likely to be, which is, again, completely counterintuitive. I think if you said, men go west and they go out and they strike out and they're pioneers. No. The men are the ones who are living with their parents, more likely.
Yeah,
and they're living at home. The women
stuck.
have gone. They're stuck. Where I live in Butler, Tennessee now, the county I live in, I'm looking at these numbers. It's super interesting. I'm looking at sex ratios. Between the ages of 20 and 40, where I live now, there are 3 men for every 2 women.
Yeah.
The women have more likely to have gone, right? They've gone off. I'm not saying it's great educational outcomes there, but like women go off to college, they move for jobs. Women are more geographically mobile. They're more socially mobile. They're doing better educationally. They're much more likely they buy a house sooner. They move out sooner. These are all things that I think a generation ago we would have thought was completely the wrong way around.
It makes me think of that book, Guyland, right? Michael Kimmel, where he kind of identifies like 5 things that the transition to adulthood: moving away from your parents, completing your education, getting a job, getting a spouse, and having a kid. And a number of years ago, it was 70% of men did this before the age of 30. And now it's down to 1/3 of men will have completed these 5 by age of 30. So it's it's being stuck in this thing called Guyland, and it's video games and drinking and kind of this perpetual adolescence.
Yeah, what's difficult about that is that there's a bit of a mixed story there. I think if we're getting more education, that's good, right? Generally speaking. Now it's taking the guys longer to get that education, and they are less likely to get it. But that takes a bit longer. Actually, maybe establishing yourself in the labor market before you start a family, maybe taking a bit of time to find your partner before you settle there. Those aren't terrible things. And so I want to put a bit of balance to that conversation. What I'm more concerned about is that, I'll say this quite bluntly maybe, but I feel what's happened is that there used to be a script for both men and women. Like my parents. My mum, she said she's going to work. Her dad says, okay, nurse or teacher. She's like, no, nurse, right? But my dad, he went off to college. Why did he go to college? Because he knew he'd get a better job. Why did he want to get a better job? Because he knew he was going to have to look after a family, right? And he was going to get married, and he was going to be the breadwinner. And when he lost his job, he told me that his only job was to get another job to look after us. And my mum knew her role too. And they had a very morally egalitarian relationship, but the script for them was pretty strong and pretty sexist, right? We tore up those scripts to a very large extent, not completely, and good. So we replaced the female script of you're going to be a wife and mother with you're going to be independent, you're going to be powerful, you're going to get educated, you're going to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, you go girl, etc. Wonderful, wonderful. We tore up the old script for men. You're going to be a husband and a provider. Tore that up as well, and we replaced it with
nothing.
A blank sheet of paper.
Yeah.
And so we've torn up the script and not replaced it. And that's the vacuum I'm talking about, because it's very hard to live in a world where there is no script.
It's so cultural too. I think, with our daughters, we define going from being a girl to a woman almost biologically. You have your period or your body changes, so now you're a woman. You think about the counter from a man, from a boy to being a man, it's not biologic. It's like you killed a wild boar, or you went to war, or there's a rite of passage. It's in our literature, right? In our cultures, in our stories that we tell. It's a narrative that takes a boy to a man rather than biological. And if it's a narrative, it's fragile. It can be taken away as well.
How many men in this room have killed a wild boar?
They're a bunch of sissies. They come to book festivals, Michael.
All right.
This is not
fun. Well, there's so many problems with that statement. But instantly, how many women here have killed a wild boar? I didn't. Okay.
But they prepared it.
I didn't know. A hand went up for the one. But I think this. This is maybe something. It's been a really difficult journey for me, because I used to believe that we're going to be androgynous, we're going to be equal, we're going to get rid of these these outdated gender roles.
You read Germaine Greer.
Yeah, I mean, I was on a panel with Germaine Greer.
The female eunuch, she wrote.
All of that. So it's a really, really, and and so some of this has been quite difficult for me, both personally and intellectually. But the point you've just made, which is that the transition from boy to man is more socially constructed than from girl to woman.
Right.
It's not that there's no social construction from girl to woman, but just like it's more culturally constructed because there are less of these obvious kind of biological markers. And that means that's why every human culture has had various ways to help boys to become men, usually involving other men and rites of passage and so on too. And I don't think we can just roll our eyes at those and say, oh, those are for the, we don't need that. We don't need any of that nonsense anymore. And somehow think that just with the passage of time, a boy becomes a man. You do have to sort of slightly make men.
Yeah.
And that making process does require some thought and some culture and some intention. I'll give you a quote from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, which I think was so powerful that I've ended up committing it to memory. Margaret Mead said, every known human society has rested on the learned, nurturing behavior of men. By the way, by nurturing, she meant like for the tribe, for general, and then she went on to say, this behavior being learned is fragile and can disappear very quickly under circumstances that no longer teach it effectively. Every known human society, it would be very hubristic of us to think we can be the first known human society that doesn't teach our boys how to become caring men.
We don't have so much time, but we were wondering how many people here have heard of Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate, yeah.
Can you raise your hand if you've heard of Andrew Tate? So see, I didn't. So it's, well, it's a toxic
Andrew
narrative.
Tate.
They're more likely to have heard of Tate's cookies, I think, than Andrew Tate. Yeah.
Okay.
But
you've obviously been here a long time because you feel completely free at insulting the audience. It's my first time here, so I'm very anxious. I want you to like me. I'm being so agreeable right now. He's being very, very offensive. No. Okay. So
no.
Well,
but before we get into
that is
just to let you know,
amazing.
In the timeline, it came out 2 years ago. You've gone around, you've crisscrossed the globe, giving these talks and hosting and thinking. If you rewrote the book today, what changes would you make? Would you have a chapter about sex, for example?
You've done your homework because you know that there was a chapter about sex that I took out.
Did you put it back in?
Nope. No, because, look, the project here is to try and make this a subject that we can all talk about, a permission space. And there are some issues, there are some things that are just so sensitive that, like sex and sex drive and differences and the regulation of all of that, that it's just like, one of my friends said to me, you cannot have that in the book because that's all anyone will want to talk about, right? No one's going to ask you about your views on technical high schools, which, by the way, we need a lot more technical high schools.
Yeah.
No one's going to ask you about technical high schools if you have a chapter on sex. They're just going to ask you about Tinder. It turns out they asked me about Tinder anyway, so I'm glad I didn't put it in. Look, the main thing is that I've now created this think tank, the American Institute for Boys and Men, to just very straightforwardly and empirically keep this on the agenda. Right? Someone has to be doing this sensibly and with charts and with good intent and working with policymakers in a non-zero-sum way. And I have decided that having gone out on this limb, I might as well stay on it for a bit and see if I can do some good while I'm here because, and this will give us the last point about Andrew Tate, because I remain very concerned about the political divide between young men and young women. I've seen it with my own sons, what happens online. So Andrew Tate is one of the most influential figures in the world. He was ranked in a representative survey of US teens 2 years ago as the most influential person on the internet. Number one, he is more trusted by young men than Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Before he was taken off TikTok, he had 10 billion views, 10 billion views. He is a massive, and he's a misogynist.
Huge in the UK.
Huge, I mean, globally, right? And honestly,
but the teachers in the UK, you say now are have to
ask the young men in your life, ask the young women in your life, right? The generational divide on this is extraordinary. It's actually the best example I know. Hands up, among you who consumes their video horizontally as opposed to vertically? In other words, this is the aspect ratio you're not noticing. Hands up who watches it. I am. I like, okay, hands up like that. Okay.
Horizontal,
Right.
yeah.
Horizontally.
Yeah.
Andrew Tate's for the vertical generation. My kid's right. It's all vertical. It's all phones. It's all vertical. And what's happening is, so there are other figures like him in a different way. He's hugely influential among a lot of young men around the world now. Is that he's become this figure. He's obviously he's under arrest now for all kinds of things. But my basic point is this: if we don't have these conversations about these facts in this tone and in this way, and we make the young men and boys in our lives feel like we're listening to them, we're paying attention, we've noticed the suicide rates, we've noticed the education, we're on it, we're working for, we create a vacuum. And culture abhors a vacuum. That vacuum will get filled by somebody else if it's not us. And so I implore all of you in your own lives, your own institutions, have a conversation about what's happening with boys and men. It doesn't mean we do less for women and girls. And if we refuse to talk about it, others will, and we might not like who they are.
I know this is so interesting. We've just scratched the surface. Please read his book. He has wonderful interviews with the Surgeon General, with Ezra Klein, and he's got one more session here with us. We're very lucky. On the last day, the last session, so you got to stick around.
That one will be fun.
That'll be fun.
Barry Wise, Brett Stevens.
But thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you.